The Garden of Eden by Hans Christian Andersen, published in 1839. Once there lived a prince who had a library far greater than anyone else has ever had, either before him or since. All his books were very beautiful, and in them he could read about and see portrayed in pictures everything that had ever happened in the whole world. There was no country, no people whom he could not learn about, but where the Garden of Eden lay was not mentioned in any of his books. This made the prince very sad, for it was paradise that interested him most. His grandmother had told him, when he was still a little boy just starting school, that in the Garden of Eden all the flowers were cakes. On each of them was written in the finest of sugar, history, geography, addition, subtraction, or the multiplication tables, and all children had to do was eat the right cakes, and they knew their lessons at once. The more cakes they ate, the better educated they became. Then he had believed his grandmother's story, but as he grew up and became wiser, he understood that the beauty of paradise was far greater and more difficult to conceive.
Oh, why did Eve pluck the apple, and why did Adam eat the forbidden fruit? If I had been Adam, man would never have fallen, and sin would not have conquered the world.
This he had said to his grandmother when he was a little boy. Now, at 17, he felt no differently, and thoughts about the Garden of Eden still filled his mind. His favorite diversion was to take solitary walks in the woods. One day, when he had ventured farther than usual, a storm overtook him. Though it was not yet evening, the day grew as dark as night, and the rain came down in torrents. Soon he lost his way. He slipped in the wet grass and stumbled over the rocks. The poor prince was wet to the skin. Exhausted, he climbed up the side of the cliff, pressing his body against the water-drenched moss. He was about to give up when he heard a strange whistling noise near him. Then he came upon a cavern in the cliff wall. Inside the cave was a fire so great that a whole deer could be roasted over it, and that was exactly what was being done. A woman who was so big and strong that she looked like a man who had put on skirts was turning a spit on which was a buck, antlers and all. She put another log on the fire. Then she turned and called to the prince.
"Come in, sit down by the fire and dry your clothes."
"It's draughty in here," the prince said.
He was shivering as he sat down on the floor near the fire.
"It's going to be a lot draftier when my sons come home," said the woman. "You are in the cave of the winds. The 4 winds of the world are my sons. Do you understand?"
"Where are they now?"
asked the prince, who had understood her well enough.
"If a question is stupid, how can one give a clever answer?" grumbled the woman. "My sons are out on their own, playing ball with the clouds somewhere up there." She pointed upward toward the entrance over the cave.
"I see," nodded the prince. "You speak more roughly than the women I am used to talking to."
"Well, they are not mothers of sons like mine." The woman grinned. "I have to be tough to keep my sons in tow, but I can take care of them, however stiff-necked they are. See those 4 leather bags hanging on the wall? They are just as afraid of them as you were of the switch in the corner. I am stronger than they are, and if they don't behave, then I pick any one of them up and put him in a bag, and there he can stay until I let him out again. There's one of them coming now."
It was the North Wind. He was clad in bearskin with a sealskin cap pulled down over his ears. He brought hail and snow in with him, and icicles were hanging from his beard.
"You'd better not go near the fire just yet," said the prince, "or you'll get frostbite on your hands and your feet."
"Ha ha ha! Frostbite!" laughed the North Wind as loud as he could. "Why, frost and coldness are what I love. How has such a little weakling as you found your way to the Cave of the Winds?"
"He is my guest," said the old woman, "and if you are not satisfied with that explanation, then I will put you in your bag. You know that I mean what I say." That quieted the North Wind down, and he began to tell about where he had been and what he had seen during the month that he had been away. "I've just come from the Arctic Ocean," he began. "I have been visiting the Barents Sea with Russian whalers. I sat sleeping on their tillers when they rounded the North Cape. Fulmars flew around my legs. They are strange birds. They flap their wings once or twice and then hold them out straight, gliding along at a good speed."
"Don't be so long-winded," interrupted his mother. "What was it like on the Barents Sea?"
"Oh, it was beautiful, flat as a dance floor. The snow was melting and the moss was green. Skeletons of walrus and polar bears lay among the sharp stones. They looked like limbs of giants and were covered with green mold. One would think that the sun had never shone on them. I blew the fog away so that I could see a little better. Someone had built a shed from the wreckage of stranded ships with walrus skins stretched over it. It had turned strange green and red colors. A polar bear sat on the roof and growled. I went down to the beach and had a look at the bird's nest there. They were filled with little naked offspring who were screaming with their bills open. I blew down into them, and that taught them to keep their mouths shut.
Down at the water's edge lay the walruses, looking like giant maggots with pigs' heads and teeth more than a yard long. You describe it well, admitted his mother. My mouth waters hearing about it. The Russians began to hunt the walruses. They thrust their harpoons into the animals, and the blood spouted out like geysers high up in the air and spattered the white ice red. It made me think of playing a little game myself. I blew and brought my own ships, the great icebergs, down to squeeze their boats. You should have heard them whimper and whine. But I whistled higher than they did. I held their ships in my vice of ice. They got so frightened and they started to unload the dead walruses and everything else they had aboard onto the ice. Then I sent them a snowstorm and let them drift south for a taste of salt water. They will never return to the Barents Sea. Then you have done evil, said his mother. What could I do? I will let others tell about, said the North Wind and grinned. But there is my brother, the West Wind. I like him better than the others. There is a smell of the salt sea about him, and he brings some blessed coldness with him.
Is that the gentle Zephyr?
Asked the prince. It is the Zephyr, all right, said the old woman, but he is not so gentle any more. When he was young, he was a sweet-looking boy, but that is all gone now. The West Wind looked like a savage. He wore a helmet on his head, and in his hand he held a big club that he had cut from a tree in one of the great mahogany forests of America. Where are you coming from? Asked his mother.
From the great primeval forest, he answered, where thorny liana stretches itself from tree to tree, where the water snakes lives and man has never set foot.
And what did you do there?
I looked at the deep river that fell from the cliffs down into the valley, sounding like thunder and made a spray great enough to bear a rainbow. I saw a buffalo swim in the river. The currents caught it and carried it among a flock of ducks down toward the waterfall. When they came to the rapids, the ducks flew up, but the buffalo couldn't fly. It had to follow the water down the turbulent falls. Oh, I liked that sight so much that I blew a storm great enough to fell trees that have stood 1,000 years and break them into kindling.
Is that all you have done? Asked the old woman.
I have turned somersaults on the savannah, patted wild horses, and blown down a coconut or two. I have a couple of stories I could tell, but it is best not to tell everything one knows. That you know well enough, old thing.
He kissed his mother so that she almost fell over backward. Oh, he was a wild boy. The South Wind arrived. He wore a turban and a Bedouin's cape. It's cold in here, he said, and threw more wood on the fire. You can tell that the North Wind came home first. It's so hot in here that you could fry polar bears, grumbled the North Wind. You are a polar bear yourself, retorted the South Wind angrily. Do you want to be put in a bag? Asked the old woman, and sounded as if she meant it. Sit down and tell us about the places you have been. In Africa, mother, began the South Wind, crestfallen. I have been hunting lions with the Hottentots in the land of the Kaffirs. The Great Plains were olive green. Here the antelopes danced, and I ran races with the ostriches, and won every time. I visited the desert. Its yellow sand looked like the ocean's floor. There I met a caravan. They had just slaughtered the last of their camels to get a little to drink. The sun burned down upon them from high above, and the hot sand fried them. The great borderless desert stretched all around them. Then I played with fine, dry sand. I rolled it up in pillars toward the sky. Oh, that was a dance. You should have seen the face of the merchant. He pulled his caftan up over his head to protect himself, and then threw himself down in front of me as if I were Allah, his god. I buried them all in the pyramid of sand. Next time I come, I shall blow it away and let their bones be bleached by the sun, so that other travelers can see that which is hard to believe in the loneliness of the desert, the fact that other men have been there before them. You've only been evil, scolded his mother. Into the bag you go. She grabbed the South Wind around his waist, bent him in half, and stuffed him into one of the leather bags. But the South Wind wouldn't keep still, and the bag jumped all over the floor. Then his mother took it, and using it as a pillow, she sat down upon the bag, and he had to lie quietly.
You have got lively sons, said the prince.
They are plucky enough, but I can manage them, answered the mother. Here comes my fourth son. It was the East Wind. He was dressed as a Chinese. Oh, that is where you have been, said the mother, and nodded. I thought you had been in the Garden of Eden. No, that is where I fly tomorrow, replied the East Wind. Tomorrow it is exactly 100 years since I was there last. Now I am coming from China. I have danced around the porcelain towers so swiftly that all the little bells rang. Down in the streets, the state officials were getting a beating. I didn't count how many bamboo canes were worn out on their backs. All the officers from the 1st to the 9th grades were being punished. Every time they were hit, they screamed, thank you, our father protector. But they didn't mean a word of it. And I rang the bells of the tower and sang Sing Sang Zoo. You are getting a little too frisky, laughed his mother. I'm glad you are visiting paradise tomorrow. It always improves your manners. Remember to drink from the spring of wisdom and to bring a bottle full of the water back to your mother.
I certainly will, said the East Wind. But why have you put my brother from the south in his bag? Let him out. I want him to tell me all about the bird Phoenix. The princess in the Garden of Eden asks to hear about that bird whenever I visit her. Please let him out, and I shall give you 2 pocketfuls of tea. I picked it myself, and it is fresh and green.
In appreciation of the tea, and because you are my favorite, I will let him out.
The old woman untied the bag, and the South Wind climbed out. He looked embarrassed because the prince had seen his punishment.
I have palm leaf.
The South Wind carefully avoided looking at the prince while he spoke.
You can give it to the princess. On it, the phoenix bird has carefully written with his bill his whole life story, all that happened to him during the 100 years he lived. She can read it herself. I saw the bird phoenix set fire to its own nest, as if it were the wife of a Hindu. The dry branches crackled, and the smoke had a strange fragrance. At last the bird itself burned with a clear flame, and became ashes, and the egg lay red hot among the embers. The shell cracked with a bang like a cannon shot, and the young bird flew up. Now he is king of all the other birds, and the only phoenix in the whole world. He has bitten a mark in the palm leaf. That is his way of sending a greeting to the princess. No more talk, let us eat, said the mother of the winds, and started to carve the deer. The prince sat down next to the east wind, and they were soon fast friends.
Tell me, begged the prince, who is this princess that you are all talking about, and where lies the Garden of Eden?
Ha ha ha, laughed the east wind. Would you like to come along tomorrow? You must remember that no man has been there since Adam and Eve were thrown out. I assume you know about them from the Bible.
Certainly, said the prince gravely.
Well, when they were banished, the Garden of Eden sank down underground, but it kept its beauty, its warmth and mild air. The Queen of the Fairies lives there, and there lies the Island of Bliss, where death can never come. If you will climb up on my back tomorrow, then I shall take you there. That is enough talking for tonight. I'm tired. Soon they all fell asleep. It was still early in the morning when the prince awoke, but to his surprise he found himself flying high up among the clouds. The east wind was carrying him and had a good grasp on him so that he wouldn't fall. They were up so high that the earth below him with its forests and fields looked like a colored map. Good morning, said the east wind. You could have slept a little longer yet. There's not much to look at. All the land below us is flat. But if you want to count the churches, you can. They look like chalk marks on the green board down there. It was the fields and meadows the east wind was referring to as the green board.
It wasn't very polite of me to not say goodbye to your mother and your brothers.
Never mind. A man who is asleep is excused, grumbled the east wind, and flew even faster. As they passed over the treetops, all the leaves and branches rustled. When they crossed the sea, the waves grew white, and the big ships curtsied deeply like swans. When evening came, they flew in darkness over a great city. The thousands of lights burning below reminded the prince of the sparks that fly from a piece of paper when it has been set on fire. It was so lovely that the prince clapped his hands, but the east wind scolded him and said that he could make better use of his hands by holding on, or he might end up hanging from a church spire.
With grace, the great eagles fly over the black forests, but the east wind flies more gracefully. Swift is the horse of the Cossacks, but the east wind is swifter. There are the Himalayas, said the east wind. It is the highest mountain range in Asia. Soon we shall be in the Garden of Eden. The wind turned in a southeasterly direction, and soon the prince could smell the fragrance of spices and flowers. Figs and pomegranates grew wild, as did a vine that bore both red and blue grapes. Here they rested for a while, and stretched themselves out in the soft grass. The flowers nodded to the winds as if they were saying, "Welcome back." "Are we not in the Garden of Eden?"
asked the prince. "Not yet," answered the wind, "but it won't be long now before we are there. Can you see the cave up on the side of that cliff? The grapevines almost hide it. We have to fly through it. Wrap your cape tightly around you. Here, the sun is burning hot, but in there it is as cold as ice. The birds that fly past the opening of the cave have one wing in the warm summer, and the other in the coldest of winters."
"So this is the gate of paradise,"
thought the prince as he wrapped himself in his cape. In they went, and cold it was, but the distance was short. The east wind spread out his wings, and they burned like fire, lighting the cave through which they flew. They were great blocks of stones, wet from the water, endlessly dropping. They had the strangest shapes. Some looked like organ pipes, and others like banners. Sometimes the room was so large that the ceiling was lost in darkness. Other times the passages were so narrow that they had to crawl on all fours to get through them. The prince thought they looked like burial chambers.
"Are we taking Death's Road to paradise?"
he asked. The east wind did not answer. He pointed toward a radiantly blue light ahead of them.
The rocks gave way to a mist, which finally looked like a white cloud in the moonlight. It was no longer cold. The air was mild and fresh like mountain air, and yet filled with the fragrance of the roses that grew in the valley. Below them was a river. Its water was as transparent as air. Gold and silver fish swam in it, and so did scarlet eels. Each time they twisted their bodies, blue sparks flew and illuminated the water. The leaves of the water lilies were all the colors of the rainbow, and the flower itself was a flame that drew its substance from the water, as oil lamps draw theirs from oil. A marble bridge carved as intricately as if it had been ivory led to the island of bliss, where the Garden of Eden lay. The east wind carried the prince in his arms, across the river to the island, and set him down among the flowers. The leaves and the petals of the flowers sang to him all the songs he had heard as a child, but their voices were far more beautiful than human songs. The prince could not recognize any of the trees. Were they palm trees or giant water plants? Certainly he had never before seen any trees so succulent and tall. Long garlands of wonderful vines, like the ones that decorate old holy books and twist themselves around the gilded first letter on their pages, hung between the trees. Around him he saw the strangest mixture of animals and plants. In the grass stood some peacocks with their great colorful tail feathers spread out. He drew nearer and touched them. They were not animals, but giant burdock leaves, as splendid as peacock tails. Lions and tigers jumped about among the bushes, tame as kittens. Doves as white as pearls beat their wings so near the lions that they touched their manes. Shy antelopes with dark eyes as deep as pools nodded their heads as if they too wanted to join the game. There was the fairy, the princess of the Garden of Eden. Her clothes were brighter than the sun, and her face as happy as a mother when she looks at her sleeping child. She was young and beautiful. A train of lovely girls, each with a star in her hair, followed her. The east wind gave her the palm leaf, the gift from the bird phoenix, and her eyes sparkled with joy. She took the prince by the hand and led him into her castle. The walls had the same transparency that you see when you hold a tulip petal up toward the sun and look through it. The ceiling was a shining flower, and the longer you looked at it, the more magnificent it became. The prince stepped over to one of the windows, looking out through it, and there he saw the tree of knowledge, the snake, and Adam and Eve. Surprised, he turned to the fairy and asked, "Have they not been banished?" She smiled and explained to him that what he saw were pictures burned into the glass by time itself. They were not like any painting he had seen, for they were alive. The leaves of the trees moved, and the people portrayed in them came and went as in a mirror. He stood before another window, and there he saw Jacob's ladder stretching far up into heaven, and he saw the angels with their great wings flying around it. Everything that had ever happened still lived inside those glass paintings. Such curious and wonderful works of art only time could create. The fairy smiled at his amazement and led the prince into another great hall in the castle, where the walls were transparent, paintings of millions and millions of happy faces, all of them laughing and singing, and their laughter merged with the songs into one melodious hymn to happiness. The faces nearest the ceiling were as tiny as rosebuds, or the point you can make with a sharpened pencil on paper. In the middle of the hall grew a large tree, and golden apples the color of oranges hid among the greenery. It was the tree of knowledge, the tree of good and evil, whose fruits Eve had picked and Adam had eaten. From its leaves fell red dewdrops, as though the tree shed tears of blood. "Come down into my little boat," bade the fairy. "It rocks as though it were floating on the swelling waters, and that is a most delightful feeling. But it never moves, though the countries of the world will pass by for us to look at." And they did. First the prince saw the snow-clad mountains of the Alps, with their black forests of fir trees and lace collars of clouds. He heard the melancholy sound of the hunters' horns and the herdsmen yodeling. The scene around them changed. Banana palms bent their long leaves down toward them, and coal-black swans swam near them. Beyond the beach, the most fantastic flowers bloomed. They were in the Dutch East Indies, the fifth continent. They heard the priests of the savages chant and saw them dance their wild dances. The islands and their blue mountains disappeared, and in their place rose the great pyramids of Egypt, the endless desert, the Sphinx, and ancient ruins of temples half buried beneath yellow sand. At last, northern lights burned above them, nature's fireworks, far more splendid than any man could construct. The prince was ever so happy, but then he had seen a great deal more than I have described. "Can I stay here forever?" he whispered. "That depends on yourself," answered the fairy. "If you do not let that which is forbidden tempt you, as Adam did, then you can live here forever." "I won't touch the apples of the tree of knowledge," said the prince hastily. "There are so many other fruits as lovely as they." "Examine your own heart, and if there is courage enough in it, then stay. But if you find doubt and weakness there, then ask the east wind to take you with him. He is leaving now, and he will not be back for 100 years. The years here pass like hours, but even 100 hours are long enough for both temptation and sin. Every evening I shall leave you, and as I go I shall cry out to you to follow me. I shall wave my hand to beckon you to come, but do not obey me, for every step you take toward me will only make it more difficult for you to turn back. If you follow me, you will enter the hall where the tree of knowledge grows. Underneath its sweet-smelling branches I sleep. As you bend over me, I shall smile, but if you kiss my mouth, then Eden's garden will sink down farther into the earth, and will forever be lost to you. The cruel wind of the desert will enfold you, and cold rain drip from your hair, and sorrow and care will be your lot. I will stay, said the prince. The east wind kissed him on his forehead and said, Be strong, and I shall see you again when 100 years have passed. Farewell, farewell! The east wind spread out his great wings that shone like the lightning of summer or the northern lights of winter. Farewell, farewell! Shouted all the flowers and the bushes, and the birds of the air followed him as far as the gates of the garden. Now begins our dance, whispered the fairy. When it is over and the sun begins to set, I shall cry out, begging you to follow me. But do not do it. Every night for 100 years this will happen, but each time you refuse me makes it easier for you to do it the next time, until at last it will give you no pain. This is the first night, and I have warned you. The fairy led him into a chamber made of white, transparent lilies. Their yellow stamens were little golden harps, and from them came the most delightful music. The loveliest young maidens, light and slender, danced around him. Their gauze-like clothes, like mist, half concealed their beautiful bodies. They sang while they danced a hymn to life, to their own eternal life in paradise. The sun was setting, the heavens became like gold, and the lilies turned the color of roses. The maidens handed the prince a cup of wine. He drank it and felt even more intensely happy than he had before. The back wall of the chamber disappeared, and he looked into the great hall where the tree of knowledge grew. Its beauty blinded him. The song coming from the countless faces on the wall sounded like his mother's voice singing to him, My child, my dearest child. The fairy waved to him, beckoned to him, and cried lovingly, Follow me, follow me. He forgot all his promises and ran toward her, on this his very first evening in the Garden of Eden. The fragrance of all the strange spices of the world that came from the garden grew stronger, and the music of the harps even more beautiful. In the hall of the tree, it seemed to him that all the millions of happy faces nodded yes and sang, One must know and experience everything. Man is the master of the world. The dewdrops falling from the leaves of the tree of good and evil no longer looked like tears, but like red, shining stars. Follow me, whispered a voice, and for each step the prince took, his cheeks grew redder and his blood pulsed even faster through his veins. I must, he breathed. It is no sin to follow beauty and happiness. I just want to see where she sleeps. I shall not kiss her. Nothing is lost unless I do that, and I shall not. I'm strong. I'm not weak. The fairy threw off her beautiful robes and disappeared in among the branches. I have not sinned yet, muttered the prince, and I shall not do it. But he pulled the branches apart to look. There she lay sleeping, as beautiful as only the fairy in the Garden of Eden can be. She smiled in her sleep. He bent over her and saw a tear hanging from her long eyelashes. Are you crying because of me? He whispered. Do not cry, fairest, most beautiful woman. Now I understand the happiness of paradise. It flows with my blood, through my veins, into my brain, my thoughts. I feel the strength of the angel's eternal life within my mortal body. Let everlasting night come. The riches of one moment like this are enough for me. He kissed away her tear. He kissed her eyes, and his mouth touched hers. A fearful clap of thunder was heard, deeper, more frightening than any ever heard before. The fairy vanished, and the Garden of Eden sank into the earth, deep, deep down. The prince saw it disappear into the dark night like a far-distant star. He felt a deathly coldness touch his limbs. His eyes closed, and he fell down as though he were dead. The sharp lashes of the wind whipped his face, and the cold rain drenched him, and then he awoke. What have I done? He sighed. I have sinned as Adam did, sinned and caused paradise to sink deeper into the earth. He opened his eyes and saw a star blinking far away, sparkling as the Garden of Eden had when it disappeared. It was the morning star. He rose. He was in the forest near the cave of the winds. Their mother was sitting on a tree stump. She looked at him with anger and disgust. Already the first evening? She scolded. I thought so. If you were my boy, then I would put you in a bag. That is exactly what will happen to him, said Death, who was standing in the shadow of one of the big trees. He was a strong old man with a scythe in his hands and large black wings on his back. In a coffin I shall put him, but not now. Let him first wander about on earth, atoning for his sins, becoming good if he can. Then I shall come, when he least expects it, and put him in a black coffin. I shall carry him on my head to the stars, for there, too, blooms the Garden of Eden. And if he has learned to be kind and good, then he shall live there forever. But if his heart and thoughts are filled with sin, then he shall sink in his coffin deeper into the earth than the Garden of Eden sank. Only once every 1,000 years shall I come to fetch him, to find out whether he must be sent even deeper into the earth or be taken to the bright and sparkling star.